G.K. Chesterton said, the most important fact about the subject of education is that there's no such thing. Education is not a subject and it does not deal in subjects. It is instead the transfer of a way of life. G.K. Chesterton also said, education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to another. As Christians, I really think we need to reclaim our understanding of education, its purpose, and why it's important if we are to be effective in the assignment that God has given us, in the commission, what God has commissioned us to do. In this series so far, and this should be my concluding episode, although I will continue to talk about education, I have been so far trying to outline for you how the church got bamboozled at some point and allowed progressives to take over the field of education or the institution of education, and how these progressives understood the quote from Nelson Mandela, which said that education is the most powerful weapon which can be used to change the world. They understood this, and Christians had understood this up until this point. But the way Christians got tricked is that progressives, who were also Christians, who had taken the Bible, crossed off everything they didn't like, and reinterpreted everything that they didn't like to say the things that they liked, they started passing themselves off as Christian ministers. One such a progressive, who was also a Unitarian, was a man named Charles Francis Porter. He lived in the late 1800s, early to mid 1900s. He was an American Unitarian minister, theologian, and author. So Unitarians were people, and they still live to this day, who they're not Christians because they reject the core tenets of Christianity, but they pass themselves off as Christians. It's just the same as your average progressive Christian. They reject the core tenets that makes Christianity what it is. These are the people that infiltrated the church. They were well educated. They were intellectuals. They infiltrated the church. They infiltrated the Christians of the time and convinced them to surrender the institution of education to the secularists. Charles Porter said this: man has waited too long for God to do what man ought to do himself and is fully capable of doing. The chief end of man is to improve himself, both as an individual and as a race. Education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism. And every public school is a school of humanism. What can a theistic Sunday school meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching? This is something that was said in the early 1900s. But this is a question we should ask ourselves today. This is a question I hope Christians seriously ask themselves. This is a question that I hope, I pray, that pastors will begin to ask themselves if you haven't started already. And the person asking the question in the 1930s is not, as I already said, is not necessarily a Christian, because he rejects the core tenets of Christianity. He's a humanist. He is proposing a new religion. He is like Antonio Gramsci. He understands what he's doing to be a religion that will replace Christianity. Again, he said, man has waited too long for God to do what man ought to do himself and is fully capable of doing. This is exactly what they're teaching in the public schools. If you believe there's God, fine, they say. But what you need to do, you can do. You don't need God. Sure, you go to church and you go to Sunday school, fine. But what needs to be done for yourself and for society, you can do. You don't need God. There's no need to involve God in the equation. You can go to God when you're not feeling well, when you need, to comfort yourself. But what needs to be done practically? This is where the whole idea of pragmatism crept in. Progressivism. As a society today, everything you see in the news, everything you see in the classrooms with these kids, in their schools, the reason why there's a fight between parents who say, hey, don't teach that to our children, and parents who say, hey, why not, is because of this progressive confusion. Progressivism is a product of secular humanism. Because remember, humanists do not have a beginning like we have as creationists. Humanists usually believe in the theory that was put forth by Charles Darwin. This is the ruling theory in academia. This is the ruling theory in your public school, in your neighborhood. When you start talking creationism, that's all right. Yeah, don't pay too much mind. He's a Christian, he has to say that. But the ruling theory is Darwinian theory of evolution. So the man here is telling us, stop waiting for God. It's the age of humanism. What did actual Orthodox Christians do? There was not sufficient. There were people that responded, as I've outlined already. But there was no sufficient response to push back against this. Most people got duped into this. Most people were too focused on things that are, yes, important, but they kind of abandoned a whole nother aspect of life for themselves and their future generations that was equally crucial, and that is education. These people, the architects of public education as we have it, understood this. They knew what they were doing. They wanted to create a certain kind of society. This was their goal. At the beginning of this series, I read you a quote by a man named Reverend Frederick T. Gates, who was a business advisor to John D. Rockefeller. And this was right at the beginning of compulsory education as we know it today, or public education, government-controlled education as we know it today. And he said that these are the people that put forth the first of the millions and billions of dollars to lay down the foundation for the progressives in order for them to take over the public education, and for the national education associations and other educations like it to have as much power as they have today. This was their vision. They said, quote, "In our dreams, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand." Stop. These people saw themselves as gods. This is the work of God. If you saw yourself as having limitless resources, only God has that. If you saw yourself as someone who people yield themselves to with perfect docility to your molding hands, you see yourself as a God. The quote continues, "The present educational conventions fed from our minds and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon the grateful and responsive rule of folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up among them authors, orators, poets, and men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. So this is kind of an elite type of talk where he's saying, we have enough lawyers, we have enough preachers and doctors, we don't need any more. We have enough people in the ivory towers. Everyone else, we need to mold them and control them and direct them in a certain way of how we want this society to be. And ultimately, is a society that worships them or the idea itself, man, humanism. We're not going to try to make these kids philosophers and scholars and scientists, no. Because then we'll create people that can think for themselves, that will challenge us. They're unhampered by tradition. What is tradition? It's Christianity. It's the way things ought to be. The people today, the progressives today will say, well, what you see today with the idea of male and female and just there being two genders, that's tradition. That's normative. So we're going to back against that. Why? Because they've been raised up by these people to have that as a mission, as a calling, progressivism, secular humanism. This is where we are today. So I'm opening up with all this to say this. As I said in my previous episode, we have to do something. I want to be able to do something. The way things are going, not many people probably see these messages. But if you see this message, I'm asking you to join me in this. I'm asking you to email me. Oh, you don't ever have to say anything to me. Do something about this. We are here today for such a time as this. Make no mistake, we will be answerable to God. God has given us an assignment. Most important of that assignment is our own house. And we're called to educate them. So yes, education should be mandatory. Should the government be in charge of education? Absolutely not. Even if the government was Christian, I would say I would like it, but I don't think it's right. I think parents and communities need to take over their own children's education. The only thing the government can do is to enforce that these communities are educating their children. There's no creating their curriculums. There's no sending this and that to the... No. Let this community educate their own children. Just have officers that go in to make sure that every child is being educated. There has to be accountability, but everyone needs to be able to educate their own children. Every community needs to be able to put together and come up with schools to educate their own children and their neighbors' children. The government has no business getting involved anywhere beyond making sure that people are actually doing what they're supposed to be. This is how it was in the beginning of this country, establishment of this country. So you want reform? This is reform. But this is reform that will not come anytime soon. If we still have another 200 years before the King Jesus comes back, we have to do something. It is my firm belief that part of the problem in the Christian world has always been, well, Christ is coming for us soon. There's no need to worry too much about this. Our most important thing that we really need to worry about and put all of our resources in is evangelism. We don't need to educate anybody past a number of classes at church. We don't need to get involved in education anywhere past high school. Just send them off to wherever they want to go, we say. That's wrong. Because, going back to Charles Francis Porter's words, education is an ally of humanism when it's in the hands of humanists. So education can be a powerful ally to Christians if it's in the hands of Christians. Earlier, I also spoke about, in a number of occasions, about a quote by another guy named Antonio Gramsci. We've already established that he was a Marxist from Italy who was alive to notice that Karl Marx's revolution did not materialize. And so he sat in jail pondering how come, and came to a conclusion that the reasons why a lot of these people would not revolt is because they have a Christian worldview. They're governed by a Christian ethic, Protestant ethic, which is why he said that socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. How do you transform the consciousness of society? Well, through education. Not to be redundant, but Francis Porter already said that the chief end of man is to improve himself both as a race and both as an individual and as a race, and that education is thus the most important ally of humanism, and that every public school is a school of humanism. He went on to say that, ask the question, what can the theistic Sunday school? Again, this is how they were going to overwhelm society and change its consciousness. They realized, wait a minute, these people, they go to church, do Sunday school, and hang out for an hour or two, but then they send their kids for 5 days a week to us. We don't need to worry about these people. We can just take their children, indoctrinate them with our own ideas, and 2-3 generations later, we will have our secular humanistic society. This is where we are today. And so you ask, well, what exactly is indoctrination? I found a quote from an article by a lady named Rebecca Oas, PhD. Her article was titled, Why Comprehensive Sexuality Education is Not the Answer. And in there, she gave a definition of indoctrination. Indoctrination is the teaching of a doctrine or a worldview that is to many at odds with their cultural norms, religious beliefs, and family values. So these Marxists and communists and secularists decided, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, sure, their children are going to school on Sundays, to church on Sundays, but then we get to keep these kids all week long. So how are we going to change society, the consciousness of society, like Antonio Gramsci said? We're going to change it by educating their kids with our idea, indoctrinating their kids with our ideas, so that by the time they're old, you send them to us for 5 hours a day for the next 12 years. By 12th grade, they'll go to college. From there, it's not going to be hard to convert them into activists on our behalf. That's what you're noticing today. That's what you're seeing today. So we need to provide an answer. We need to do something about this. We need to see this for what it is, as a mistake, as a mistake in history. Our forefathers made a huge mistake, and now we have to begin to undo it. Please don't hear that I'm undermining the people that are already doing the work today. There's a lot of great Christian schools out there, Christian programs. There's a lot of people that are homeschooling. I know a lot of people that homeschool their children. So the movement is alive and well, but we need more people to wake up. We need more people to wake up for this movement to become a threat for real. And it is a threat right now. But we need an actual revival in the churches for all the people that are still holding out. A, because they don't know what to do, or B, because they're still deceived. The people teaching your children in the classroom, they have no idea, some of them. They're just doing their job the best way they know how. They're frustrated, they don't have enough resources. They've been made to believe that money and some kind of reform is what's going to change things. But the actual reform that's necessary, nobody wants to do it because it's hard to do. The reform that we as Christians need to ask for and work for and demand is a reform that changes things back and takes education away from the secularists and puts it in the hands of the church. That's not impossible right now, but that's a long-term goal. The immediate goal right now, for those who have children, if you're like me, you have a very young family, you plan and start planning now to not send your kids to government school. For those of you who already have children in there, take them out. So in this website, Biblical Foundations for Christian Teaching, it talks about the different things that cause Christians to see education differently. And Christians will see education differently from even Muslims. or Buddhists or Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses. For Christians, for example, God's revelation is the basis for all truth. And if you go into a math class with this kind of understanding, math all of a sudden takes a whole nother turn. Another thing that is a kind of a foundation for Christian education is that parental responsibility is the priority control. I feel like a lot of times, and I've done this my entire Christian life, and a lot of people do this, we're too worried about all kinds of other things while the most important thing is right there in front of us. And that's the education of our children. And I'm not even talking about the ideologies that are flooding these schools. I talk about it in my other videos, and I use that as a reason why we need to. But right now, at this point, we're just talking about the foundation itself is messed up. And so we need to correct this from the foundation. Removing the books in the classrooms, sure, yeah, but that's a temporary fix. That's a temporary fix. We need a long-term goal. We need to take back education. This is what we need to do. Bringing back prayer into the public school and bringing back Bible reading is fine, but that's a temporary fix. The long-term fix is we need to recapture the entire thing. And how we recapture it is we educate our young now who will grow up to become the future leaders in these communities, who will then, as the numbers add up, will influence society to tip the scales back in favor of the right things, the godly things, the truth, beauty, goodness. To close out here, I have a few minutes that I wanna play here of Doug Wilson, and he is going to be talking to us about education. And his whole vision is that if we want our children to have a Christian worldview, we're not going to send them to the government because the government wants to teach them their worldview. So let's see what Doug Wilson thinks about all this.
So how does a Christian get a Christian worldview, and what part does education play in that? And as a part of that, should a Christian send their children to public schools?
Okay, so I'll start with that last one. Christians should not have their children in the government school system willingly. You know, I understand that there are exceptions, there are difficult cases, and I don't want to, you know, if a single mom has got 5 kids and 3 jobs, I don't want to kick her in the head. What I want to do, if I have anything to do with her, is have our church offer to help out. Mm-hmm. You know, so I want to make sure that I'm not piling on someone who's already got enough troubles, right? But everywhere parents have a choice, and I think that they do, in still remaining in most of the cases. Everywhere parents have a choice, I believe that we should be getting our kids out. And even in the hard cases, if you've got no husband and 5 kids and 3 jobs, your problems are not going to go away if 10 years from now, one of your children is transgender, another one's a lesbian, another, you know, your problems are not decreasing, right? So Christians ought to be relying on the body of Christ. I want my children to be brought up as children of the King. I want them to receive a Christian education. How can we do this? How can we make it happen?
So how does your church make that happen? You talked about you want for the church to be able to help people in those sorts of situations.
Our church has a deacons fund, and a subset of that deacons fund is a Christian education fund. And we want we're conservative Presbyterian types. We practice infant baptism. And when a child is baptized, the parents make a profession of faith to bring the child up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And then I turn to the congregation and say, do you, as a congregation, commit to helping these parents in the Christian nurture of this child? If so, please signify that by saying amen. They say amen. That means we're all in this together. All right. So we have a Christian education fund that is available to anybody who would love their child to get a Christian education, and money's a problem. So if money's a challenge, we don't want any covenant child in our church to miss a Christian education because of money.
Now, you might have a lot of problems with Doug Wilson. I actually like Doug Wilson. I don't agree with him on some things, but I believe we agree on more than we disagree, and I believe that what we agree on are actually much more important than what we disagree on. But regardless to what you might think about Doug Wilson, okay, and his beliefs, that is profound, what he just said, what he just outlined. That is profound, and that's a template to me that every church should adapt. Why not? Every church needs to have a Christian education fund, in my view. In our church, we don't baptize children, but we dedicate children. And one of the things that my pastor does is he looks at the parents and asks them the same questions. Do you agree to raise this child in the ways of God and blase blase? And then he looks to the congregation and said, do you guys agree and commit to helping this family raise their child in the ways of God? Well, I think once the church says that, the church has committed to giving money, okay, towards a Christian education for every child in that church. This is what I think should happen. And this is happening, as you see, Doug Wilson. I'm sure I know there's many others, but we need more. This needs to spread out even more. We need to overwhelm the system. And God is with us. Thank you so much. Again, I won't stop. I will keep going after it. I will do whatever I can, but I'm only one man. And I will talk to you guys in the next episode.